Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am very happy to bring the conversation I had with Gina Rippon. Gina is Professor Emeritus of Cognitive Neuroimaging at Aston University in the United Kingdom. Her research involves use of state-of-the-art brain imaging techniques to investigate developmental disorders such as autism, profiling different patterns of brain activity in individuals with autism. She has also looked at the under-recognition of autism in women and girls, especially within the neuroscience research. And that is what much of the topic of her new book is, which is called Off the Spectrum. And that's what we talk about. We start by talking about this increase in autism cases over the past 25 years. Of course, we define autism, which is actually not easy to do. I mean, it's easy to do diagnostically, but a little bit more abstractly, it starts getting very fuzzy. We talk about origins of autism, where it comes from, some of the early researchers that were looking at this as its own kind of disorder. We talk about the history of the diagnosis, themes of identity, what the current diagnostic criteria is, specific presentations in females, neurological features, eating disorders, the future of autism research, and many other topics. I really, really enjoyed this conversation. Gina's wonderful. Her previous books have been great as well. There's a little bit of, I guess, my day job coming in. We talk. It gets kind of clinical in one part of the conversation, which I thought was helpful since people talk about autism all the time, to really delineate what is and what is not autism. So we spent a little bit of time on that. But really where the best part of the conversation is where her research has been, specifically how there's this under-recognition of autism in women and girls. Most people have seen autism as like a male, or seen most often in boys, which it is, but it is under-recognized in women and girls to their peril. So it's really, really important, the research that she's doing. And it was quite wonderful to talk with her about an important topic. As always, you can find this conversation and all other conversations at my Substack, convergentdialogues.substack.com. So get over there, subscribe. Subscribing helps, if you can believe it still. After many, many years, I still really, really value when people subscribe. Lots of great conversations. You get it straight into your inbox. Know when a new episode's up. You don't have to worry about trying to check in and see what I've posted. So subscribe over there. You can also find me on YouTube. You can subscribe there as well. And now I bring you Gina Rippon. I am here with Gina Rippon. Gina, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I'm looking forward to speaking with you.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, well, I've followed your work for a little bit of time. I had read Gender in Our Brains, which is one of your previous books, and you have a new book out, which is fantastic. It's called Off the Spectrum: Why the Science of Autism Has Failed Women and Girls. Important topic. So we're going to get all into it. Before we do, why don't you tell listeners who you are professionally, academically, and any of the pertinent details?
Okay. So my name's Gina Rippon, and I'm Professor Emeritus of Cognitive Neuroimaging at the Aston Brain Centre in Birmingham in the UK. So have spent my research career using various types of brain imaging techniques to metaphorically root around in people's brains. And I'm really interested in what makes brains different, how brains get to be different from other brains, and how this affects the owners of those brains, so how their behavior might change. So I spent almost all of my research career looking at so-called atypical conditions, like cognitive problems, children with dyslexia, or behavioral problems such as autism, or psychiatric disorders such as schizophrenia.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll talk about sexual dimorphism and gender differences in the brain and all that stuff. You wrote a whole book on that, so I'm sure we'll get into some of that
yes.
Throughout the conversation.
So, it will be touched upon, I'm
now,
sure.
I don't know. I don't know about how it is over in the UK. I know how it is here in the States. So you can help me square the circle, if you will. But in the United States, we have a dramatic increase in autism cases over the past, let's say, 25 years. And so I'm not sure you can kind of switch between UK, US numbers, whatever you're working with is fine. But in your book, you mentioned how autism is still diagnosed less in females, young girls. It's sort of casually or colloquially known as like, oh, that's a boy problem, or young boys have that more than young females. Again, that's not to say that females never have it, but it does seem to be diagnosed less in females. I guess it generally is kind of the whole thesis of the book here. Why have females been overlooked in diagnosis and treatment? And why have people not challenged that stereotype of, oh, it's a kind of a thing for boys or for men or things like that? What's the story here on this?
Well, I think you've certainly in the UK, we have the same kind of increase in diagnoses. And I think the issue is an increase in diagnoses. Sometimes people think, they talk about autism epidemic as though all of a sudden there's lots and lots of cases springing up. I actually think it's because, well, two things. The definition of autism has become much more generous, inclusive, however you like to think about it. So people are getting better at recognizing it. So I don't think there's all of a sudden lots and lots of more cases of autism. I think there's a better recognition. So I think that's part of it. The other thing is what you touched on, that this kind of colloquial autism is a boy thing, which is a sort of stereotypical belief about autism and informs some of the kind of, more common stereotypes of autism. But it also informs the whole autism community. So because it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So teachers, for example, if a boy is playing up in class and showing slightly odd patterns of behavior, might, the autism red flag might be raised. Whereas if it's a girl, she's a girl, girls don't get autism. And it actually also affects the diagnostic process as well, which is a lot of one of the things I'm talking about in the book, in that once this kind of emerged as a characteristic of autism, so there were more cases of autism being flagged up in boys, then the whole kind of diagnostic machinery started focusing on the people who normally get autism, in inverted commas, who are boys. So it also affected the kind of tests that we used. So girls, again, in inverted commas, failed those tests. So you then got gradually increasing snowball effect, if you like, of more and more boys being recognized, which wasn't matched by the number of girls being recognized.
Yeah, we'll come on to the actual criteria. I think is important. This is where some of my day job starts to mix in with the podcast a bit. So I'm a clinical psychologist by day, and have done these assessments, evaluations for people. So this is where there's a blurring here as far as this. So tell us about what is autism in terms of how you define it, how you see it. You give a pretty helpful history. You talk about from all the way back from Blurler to the current DSM-5 TR and everywhere in between. There seems to have always been this focus on inwardness, aloofness, challenges with social interactions as a pretty major feature of what we now call autism. It's been called different things, but people are picking up on something over 120 years of there's something significantly different than most folks. And so you there's a part in the book, I forget where you talk about clinicians see it one way, psychologists see it one way, geneticists see it another way, neuroscientists see it another way, where all of us are looking at autism with a little bit of a different lens, which is fine. That's not a bad thing. But what can be not so good is that you're getting 16 different definitions of what autism is, trying to talk about the same thing. So yeah, how do you define autism? What is it for you, holistically?
Right. Well, I think you've captured the problem. I think the first chapter in the book is called something like "What is Autism?" And when I first wrote it, the editor said, "So you've spent 7,000 words telling me we don't actually know," which I think is perhaps captured it well. I think it's the core aspect of autism, which is captured in the name, especially in the name that's used across the world, is this appearance of social isolation or lack of social instinct, perhaps you could say. Somehow there's a group of people who fail to automatically absorb the rules of social behavior. So they find it very difficult to interact with other people. And the very early cases that people like Kanner talked about were also the case that they didn't seem to want to interact with other people. So there was this kind of social isolation, which was almost by choice. And he noticed that in the quite young children he was looking at. So that's the core factor. Autism is something to do with a social difficulty. And associated with that in the very early cases were quite marked behavioral difficulties. So children who were obsessed with very narrow interests of a particular kind, children who were absolutely panicked by any kind of change, who were, implacable that everything had to be done the same way in the same order. And very often that's kind of forgotten as an aspect of autism, although particularly with the most severe cases, it's the most intrusive aspect into everyday life. Yeah. And so it's almost very strange, two particular pillars, like the social behavior and this very odd rigidity, lack of flexibility, repetitive behaviors like hand flapping or head banging, etc., which may come from a common core, which is where the neuroscience comes in. But the focus has always been on the social aspect.
Yeah, I certainly, when we get to the current criteria, I want to spend a little bit of time on that, because I think there's some opinions I have about it as well. So before we get there, so there's kind of an origins of who sort of I don't want to say founded or discovered, but started to catalog, if you will, some of these things. You talk about the role of Kanner, you talk about the role of Asperger, which is where I believe we got the name Asperger's for a while. Of course, he's got some misadventures with the Nazi Party, of course, which is not great. But talk about their role in the history of autism. And it was almost considered like a childhood schizophrenia in the very early stages, 30s and 40s. But where do we start to see it kind of cataloged, if you will, or giving this kind of taxonomy of this own kind of thing?
Well, I guess certainly in the majority of any kind of writing about autism, Leo Kanner gets the credit, if you like to call it that. So he wrote a very influential paper in 1943 where he looked at 11 different cases of young children who were showing marked behavioral problems. And what he was looking for was some kind of common factor, because at that stage, the whole idea of mental health issues, what we might call them now, psychiatric disorders in the past, etc., clinicians were looking for common factors to say, is there something we can say about several people which is common to them all? And sometimes there was a bit of self-aggrandizement. You wanted to call it Kanner's syndrome, etc. So you would identify, rather like you might do in physical illnesses, you wanted to find a set of problems which went together, and you could say, oh, we're going to call this. And childhood schizophrenia was the first term, because there wasn't at that stage the idea that there were developmental disorders. There was an interest in schizophrenia, which was emerging as either schizophrenia or what was called manic depression. as manifestations in adults of severe behavioral and cognitive problems, but there wasn't anything matching in children. So Kanner and Asperger and Grunia-Sukareva, who hopefully we'll get onto, were working with children and saying, these children have a particular problem, and maybe if we could get them all together and work out how we might help them, that there would be a common label we could give them. But they didn't have anything at the time. So childhood schizophrenia was the idea that these children showed weird patterns of behavior, and I use the term weird advisedly. And maybe it's a childhood version of the psychosis that we see in adults.
Yeah, it's interesting how how the history of groupings of sorts and how that has continued to evolve. We'll see that with the DSM that comes online, and then and all the different iterations of it. Yeah, I want to bring in here Sukareva. It was a story I wasn't familiar with, and how, again, discovered as doing a lot of work here. I mean, but certainly let's just use that. Looked at how autism was in females, but we don't hear that story a lot. We don't hear, there's nothing named after her. A lot of her findings were silenced, and she found some of these differences and really kind of highlighted that. We see this in young girls as well. What's the story there with her?
Well, she was a Russian psychiatrist who published in the 1920s, similarly as was the practice at the time, of individual children that she was seeing in her hospital clinics who showed what she felt were sort of common characteristics. But she talked about both boys and girls. She published case studies of both boys and girls and actually commented on the differences between them. So in that way, she actually preempted anything that Kanner or Asperger did, who never commented until later on the notion that maybe it was different in girls, or we should maybe be asking different questions, etc. But her work, for all sorts of reasons, which I cover in the book, never got the attention that Kanner and Asperger did. And Asperger was later anyway. Even though it's later on, Kanner did communicate with Sukareva, so he certainly knew of her and must have been aware of her early work. Asperger published in the same journals that she did, but for whatever reason, her work never had the impact that theirs did. And it wasn't really until the last decade that people started saying, actually, there was somebody who was writing about autism before the so-called fathers of autism, who actually had a lot to say about the differences between males and females. So she disappeared, which was the kind of, I think, ironic footnote, if you like, to the history of autism.
Well, yeah, you have a female psychiatrist writing about autism and how it shows up in females, and much like how we underplay autism in females, the woman that's investigating this is also getting kind of silenced and sidelined. So yeah, there is some kind of tragic irony there. Well, we get to the DSM-3. So I'm a little rusty here on my history of the DSM. I believe the first DSM was in 1952, if I'm right on this. And the second was, I believe, 1960. I could be wrong on that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so the third one, which was, really the first two sort of kind of feel like a compendium to psychoanalysis of sort. A lot of the people that were on the things, it was a sort of like a brochure of how do we call all these things that are hysteria and neuroses and all these things. The language is a bit antiquated, of course, but it was the first attempt at trying to get some kind of taxonomical system. So by the time you get to the DSM-3 in 1980, this is where you really see I would say the first I mean, the first kind of structure or model of what we know what it looks like today. I mean, it really is the kind of first of sorts of that. And so just, again, as a reminder for listeners, the DSM-3 is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It's the so to call a Bible, if you will. It's the kind of the manual of where you look up the criteria for all of the mental health disorders. So DSM-3, so it's the third edition, 1980. And we get in there Asperger's disorder, we get PDD, pervasive developmental disorder, and the PDD-NOS, of course, the infamous one that was widely used as a kind of catch-all. What, tell us, how did, I guess, because this was being put together during the late 70s, and then so in 1980 it comes out. What was the idea at that time, late 70s and 80s, of how we understood autism, but we were still using a axial system. So again, for listeners, axis was the sort of, you had an axis 1, a 2, a 3, or 4, and a 5. And the axis 1 was where you had all the clinical disorders, so autism would fit in there. And then axis 2 was personality disorders, bracketed as a sort of kind of separate kind of thing. And then 3 was physical disorders, like diabetes or hypertension. And then 4 was psychosocial issues. And 5, I think, was like a score number to show like functioning. So, it was a different system. Everything was a little bit disjointed. How did autism and Asperger's and PDD kind of conceptually work back in the first DSM-3?
Right. Well, yes, absolutely. It was a bit of a revolution of how we thought of autism at the time. And preceding that, there was, as you mentioned, it was entangled with the kind of psychoanalytical movement. So there was a belief that autism was something to do with parenting. So we have the whole refrigerator mother saga, where there was the belief that inadequate parenting led to these children withdrawing, into themselves, etc. And there was some really unpleasant treatments associated with it. With mothers seeking help for their children were made to go through quite intrusive therapeutic interventions themselves. But about the 1970s, 80s, it was becoming clear, bearing again also we were understanding more about genetics, that autism was a hugely heritable disorder. So there was physical questions about the physical aspects of the condition. And the whole idea of this kind of Bruno Bettelheim, refrigerator mother was very firmly, gladly knocked on the head. And they were starting to say, well, if we've got a condition that has got some kind of physical basis, then we need to focus much more on the kind of symptom patterns that are characteristic to see if we can identify genetic factors which are associated with them, etc. So that was the DSM-3 really marked that transition. It also coincided with people like Lorna Wing in the UK, a psychiatrist in the UK, who'd working with Judith Gould, again in the UK, saying, we're really interested in this idea of autistic children, but at that point it was considered to be quite rare, and the cases that were attracting the diagnosis that existed at the time were quite impaired. They were children who were mainly institutionalized and needed a lot of support. And Wing and Gould said, they had talked about Canna's walled garden, which is a nice image, that they said there's lots of other children who've got similar problems who don't fit into the box that we currently have. So effectively what they did was made the box bigger, if you like. In fact, Lorna Wing talks about opening Pandora's box because this is the point at which it looked as though cases of autism were exploding because the definition became much more generous. There was beginning to be, as you say, an emerging taxonomy, so it was much easier for people to gather the information because they had the kind of checklists that were needed. So it started to be acknowledged this was a developmental disorder. In the early stages, it had to be identified within the first 30 months of of life. So it was very much something you looked for in children, in young children. And that was a bit of a breakthrough too in itself. So that was the point at which, there was an idea that there was a separate syndrome, whatever term you like to put to it, which was pervasive. It affected all sorts of aspects of behavior. Language in particular, at that point, was a focus of an abnormality. And again, I use that term advisedly. And the emergence of Asperger's was again to do with the idea that there were children who had all sorts of behavioral problems, but weren't as behaviorally or cognitively impaired as some other children. So at that point, they thought, and Lorna Wing became a sort of Asperger advocate. And she said, well, actually, what he was writing about seems like a related but separate condition. So Asperger's syndrome was added as a separate condition.
And kind of remind us about the PDD, the pervasive developmental disorders. I mean, that was a big category that was used for a while.
Yeah.
What was the idea behind this?
That was the idea, as I mentioned early on, the idea of psychiatric disorders wasn't really considered in children. I mean, there were children with intellectual impairment, which may well be associated with physical disorders such as Down syndrome, for example. So they knew there were children who didn't develop as they should, but they were kind of separate from behavioral assessment. So once they started collecting evidence of abnormal, unusual, atypical behavior in quite young children, and the difficulties affected all aspects of their behavior. So it wasn't just a single kind of problem, hence the pervasive aspect of it. Right. So it was a kind of ragbag, catch-all category.
It was a catch-all. Yeah, it was a catch-all,
Yeah, and I think even more, I do mock it slightly, the PDD, pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified. You think, what a wonderful taxonomy that can come up with such a vague term as that. We couldn't fit it into anything else, so here you are. And I think there was
a lot of those things.
Yes, so the parents call it pediatricians didn't decide. So they went along, and had hours and hours of assessment, and at the end they were told, your child has a pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified.
Yeah. I mean, again, this is one of those things. If you're going to do psychological assessments, you're going to put someone through hours of testing and all these things. You got to have something. You got to answer the question of sorts. Now, granted, there are cases where things are just so complicated. I mean, that's fair. But and nowadays we don't do NOS. I mean, we used to do the old cognitive disorder NOS, which was, again, that was such a throwaway. People use it all the time. It's just like, well, there's something cognitively, adrift, but we don't know what it is. NOS, not otherwise specified. So it was such an easy kind of get out of the problem kind of. So you get DSM-3, I think revised, in the mid '80s or '87, something like that, and then you get to DSM-4, which is '94, I believe, and that was another big one. I think they had. I think there was the change from DSM-3 had manic depressive, and then I do think DSM-4 added bipolar as a separate thing. Yep. Manic depressive is sort of the old term for bipolar, but they started to have more research on bipolar, and they started to kind of fill that in of sorts, and they kind of, there's certain changes, and then we had the TR, the text revised, I think in 2000, I think, for the DSM-4. So finally, we get to the DSM-5, and the DSM-5 was kind of stuck in development hell for decades. I mean, literally. And and I remember it finally got put out in 2013. I mean, it was supposed to be put out in 2008 and 2010, and it just kept getting pushed and pushed and pushed. And there was some controversy around it. So I'm not going to bore listeners with how the DSM is kind of put together. It's task groups and all these things with psychiatrists and psychologists. It's a whole process. It's very political. But I will say the reason I'm spending a little bit of time on this is because autism is, I think, a bit overdiagnosed at the moment. And everyone thinks that they're on a spectrum, or a lot of people think they're on a spectrum, which I really push back on. And I think it really does a disservice to folks that have, pretty severe symptomatology and presentations of autism. It's kind of one of those things, if everybody has something, then nobody has it kind of thing, right? It's you do need, we have distinctions for a reason. And people aren't walking around with, everyone's got some version of a neurodevelopmental disorder. I mean, this is sort of the importance of this is you have symptoms and you have behaviors, but that does not necessarily mean that it's connected to certain parts of your brain that didn't develop, as we would say, neurotypically as other folks. So this is where I think it's important to see, at the end of the day, going all the way back to Asperger and Connor is, people are trying to figure out groupings, right? At the end of the day, disorders are a shorthand. They're trying to just get together a constellation of symptoms that you see consistently that are saying something. And that's important. But it's important to get it right, and it's important to do it well because, but these things are not meant to be identities. They're not meant to be, some kind of a way of bracketing, some social awkwardness. I mean, for folks that really are dealing with autism, it is a really tough challenge, like all mental health challenges are. So DSM-5, why did the autism task force and work group was the most controversial? So here's the big thing. People liked, quote unquote, I'll say like, and again, in brackets, but it was the Asperger's thing felt safe in some ways. It was, I can get on well in the world, I can do things, but I have some limits. And it wasn't as, this is just how it happened. It wasn't as stigmatized in the world. Like if you had autism, you had some maybe more serious issues. But if you have Asperger's, you're more functional. You just have some difference. Okay, and people like that, so to speak, and you had a lot of Asperger's. So what the DSM overhaul was for the whole thing, they took out the axle system. So there's no axis 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And now it was, everything's on a continuum, which in theory, I think probably makes sense. We're not doing discrete categories. We're going to do these more continuous things. Okay. So there was autism spectrum. We have schizophrenia spectrum. We have, spectrums, right? That's what we have. And so, there's no more access system. I think what they break it down now is level 1, 2, and 3. 3 is the most severe autism, but now people that were kind of the old Asperger's would fall under level 1 autism, as if you needed to place it. I'll go through the specific criteria in a minute, but tell us, when the DSM-5, why was this so controversial? Why it took forever, but why was it so controversial specifically with the kind of autism task force, work group, all that?
I think, again, it emerged at a time of other pressures, other changes. You mentioned the idea of stigmatizing, and it coincided with movements in both the UK and the US of the idea that if you called somebody schizophrenic, that's all anybody saw. So, somebody who was diagnosed with schizophrenia, you wouldn't believe what they said if you asked them a straightforward question, kind of thing, because they're schizophrenic. So there was a kind of political aspect to it. So at one level, people with mental health conditions welcomed the idea that there was a name that could be given to the problems they had, because it was a name that you could use to explain your difficulties, but also it held out hope that, if you knew what it was, then there may be help or even a cure, in inverted commas, available. So that was the kind of good side of labeling. The bad side of labeling was it was seen as stigmatizing. So I think the idea of Asperger's, for example, was partly to do with, at that point, there was a concept of autism as high and low functioning. Because we always have to remember in these kind of discussions that there are groups of people who are profoundly impaired, nonverbal, self-injurious, institutionalized, etc., who are called autistic. And obviously, well, not obviously, but they were known as low functioning, whereas at the other end, there were people who could live, go to mainstream schooling. And that was another aspect of educational changes, that you didn't put children in institutions. You tried to ensure they remained in the mainstream. So that was another aspect. So there was children who ticked the boxes for autism, the triad of impairment at that point, of which a core function was difficulty with language, maybe delayed language development, difficulty with understanding the nuances of language, particularly social, etc. So they were socially awkward, partly because of their difficulties with communication. Whereas there was another group who didn't show any such language difficulties. They clearly were still socially awkward, but they were very often the sort of stereotypical individual who was a bit odd, but extraordinarily bright. The geniuses, the people who would solve problems, invent things, the Steve Jobs and the Bill Gates and people like that. So Asperger's actually had, and it was interesting to see how that played out and how the information that was going to disappear affected that community, because they became they were anyway active. They were at the forefront of the idea that you don't talk about a pathology or a disorder or dysfunction in autism, because autism, and they did have a very blinkered view of what autism was, their autism. Autism wasn't an impairment, almost autism was a gift. Look how amazingly successful these people are, etc. And so that was part of it too. And therefore, people were saying, how different is high functioning autism from Asperger's, for example? And that was a long part of the discussion. There was also the whole historical argument, once it was discovered, of Asperger's involvement with Nazi Germany, and the alleged, there seems to be quite a lot of evidence of his involvement with sending children to hospitals like Spiegelgrund, etc. So there was a kind of political element there that this wasn't a very good idea to have this man's name associated with this condition. So I think that was part of it. And there was the idea that before, if you had the tiers, as you talked about, it still implied neatly defined boxes. And it was becoming more and more clear with the, characteristic meme about autism. If you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. That the group of people to whom this name was being attached were not easily divided into subtypes. So you wonder about the discussions around the committee table. How about getting rid of all the subtypes and just have one spectrum with levels of severity? And, at one end you have what is called profound autism. In fact, I came across something recently about frank autism, which didn't resonate well with me. But anyway, the acknowledgement that there was a category, but that there were levels of severity, and where you were on the spectrum affected how well you might be able to be integrated into everyday life. So I think it was an idea to genuinely be inclusive without specifically labeling people, which was useless, if you like, and that sounds bad, for geneticists, for example, because if you're trying to find the genetic basis for a disorder, you want to know what that disorder is. And being told, here's 3,000 people, all of whom behave slightly differently, but we've called them all autism or autistic, isn't very helpful for geneticists in particular, but also neuroscientists like me. You want to have a group of autistic individuals who are pretty homogeneous in terms of what you're looking for, homogeneously different from a group of neurotypicals, etc. So if you've got 1,000 autistic people and their behavioral profiles are all quite different. That's a challenge. But that was felt to reflect autism in itself, which is why it became the umbrella concept in DSM-5.
Yeah, I mean, again, as we continue to do more research, as I said, disorders really. Maybe I've just been working too long. I mean, I just don't find disorders very helpful. That's not in a way of, oh, I don't want to have a label. It's more of, no, it just is a shorthand to try and capture a constellation of symptoms. That's it. That's all it is. It's not defining. It's not all these things. And you can put 10 people in front of you with autism, diagnosed, the whole thing, and it's going to have 10 different presentations. And that's how, you could do this with depression, you could do this with anxiety. And it's not even this, do you meet criteria, right? You can meet criteria, but what does it look like or how does it present is going to be different because each person is different. And so it's just so, it's so flexible and it's so amorphous sometimes. And so I get really just kind of worried when people are wanting a label or seeking a label of any sort, because it's like, well, even the label itself isn't just it's not as firm and static as you think it is, right? There is this kind of sponginess to it of sorts, which is, again, that's becoming that's a problem. That's in some ways a good problem, because that's what happens when you do good science. You learn more things and you're like, you know what? This isn't as what we thought it was. We have to kind of go back to the drawing board. And there is a lot of overlap with psychopathology with symptoms. I mean, for many disorders.
There's a really...
Okay, so let me just... Go ahead, yeah.
Okay, I was just going to say there's a nice statistic that I think it was a Finnish psychiatrist worked out, that if you take DSM-5, looking at major depressive disorder as a category, and there's 9 particular symptom groups under that heading, and somebody to get a diagnosis of major depressive disorder has to satisfy 5 of those 9, but it could be any 5. So he's worked out actually, I think it's something like 1,497 different ways of getting a diagnosis of major depressive disorder using DSM-5, which possibly says it all.
That totally makes sense.
But I do think...
no, that totally makes sense.
I was going to say, I absolutely agree with you and rail against the rigidity of psychiatric diagnoses, and even more the use of diagnostic categories, which we might come on to. But it is amazing how important the term autism, in particular with the people I've been interviewing, is to those people, particularly late diagnosed individuals who may have had a lifetime of all sorts of different labels. So it's not as though this is suddenly a new aspect of their life. And the relief with which they receive a diagnosis of autism is really powerful. And they say, I found my tribe, even if, and you wouldn't like to disappoint them by saying, actually, we don't know what autism is anyway, and the term autism is meaningless. But they really feel it's important. It gives them an identity. So I do sometimes, when I'm kicking against psychiatric diagnosis, think, just be aware that this is actually important for people. And so sometimes when there is arguments, so there's a big one going on in the UK at the moment about overdiagnosis, ADHD, autism, all of that. Everybody's being overdiagnosed, which I think you mentioned.
It's the same here.
And you think, well, actually, what do you mean by overdiagnosed? If this is, if this is the problem that somebody has, and if actually giving them a category, if you like, or a tribe, as they call it, to which they belong, is important, then I'm not sure we should take too much of the this is all related to getting benefits, of course. I don't know if it's the same in the US. We should be careful not to kick it too much.
I would say, so I agree and disagree. I'll say I do agree that it is important for people to, it's like when you go to a doctor, right? And you got a sore throat and you're like, what is this? It could be 20 things. And, I'm hoping it's just a bad cold and I can, take some medicine and then I'll be fine in 10, 14 days. Fine. And, you want that. Like, what do I have? Doc, tell me what I have. Well, you have, flu A, or, you got strep, take this, you'll be fine. And you are, and that's it. There is some kind of ease and relief to know, oh, okay, this is what I have. Okay, cool. So I think with autism, what you're saying, I agree with. I think that sometimes let's say, like kind of you were saying, kind of the late onset, like, my whole life I was told I had this and this and this. And I finally got what captures, at the very least, what I've, kind of my experience of what's been going on I totally agree with that. I totally hear that. I think where I disagree a little bit is I don't think having disorders as a part of your identity is very helpful, generally. I think, and we can talk about how, autism is a lot of things. It's not just disorder, it's difference, it's all these things. That's fine. But I think what's happening is when you start to have too much of that, as it sounds like in the UK too, it's definitely here in the US, you will have people say colloquially, well, that's just, kind of my spectrum, or there's somewhere on the spectrum, and then we're talking about social awkwardness as being, well, I'm just on the spectrum a little bit. And people are using that so broadly and so colloquially that it starts to really, I think, for people that have really serious deficits with autism, or even just significant difference, it does start to, I don't want to say water it down, but it does start to blur it of like, okay, well, like this is something that is legitimately seriously difficult for me, or that I am having some interactions differently. And the person that's just kind of awkward at the party or at certain events, now thinks they're also in the same spectrum with me. And I think that's not any individual's fault. But I do think as a society, if we're making that too common, we're making that too easy, I think that does a disservice, because everyone's walking around thinking they're just somewhere on a spectrum. And I don't think that's the intention of these things. That's where I kind of start to push a little bit back on that. What do you think about this?
Well, I think it's to do with the neurodivergence movement, which I think neurodiversity, which is slightly different, but obviously central to discussions about autism. And it maybe we're at the stage where we have this quite rigid view. I mean, even the name neurotypical, if you like, suggests that this is how we should be. This is how you behave socially, et cetera, and that's historically quite rigid, inflexible. Certainly, it's the kind of discussions I had about gendered socialization. The very rigid, inflexible belief this is what girls were like or should be like, and if you're a girl, this is what you've got to be like. And nobody's challenged the idea of this typical box. So if you find socializing difficult, or if sensory issues, which I think are perhaps a more real problem that people might have, and you talked about differences rather than disorders, so you could say, actually, if we start to think, and this comes into neuroscience, my sort of neuroscience, if I think every brain is different from every other brain, and we have a kind of mosaic of brain characteristics which relate to both biology and environment, then you can start to say, well, there is no one right way of being, and therefore people could be different, and so we might be at the stage where we're challenging this kind of rigid picture of what's typical. And maybe we'll move on and people don't have to apologize for saying, by the way, I'm autistic. And if I go on for too long, could you stop me kind of thing. So, maybe I'm slightly rose-tinted view of what's going on, but I don't think we need to forget that.
Yes, no, and there's always the danger. I'm a bit too cynical in some ways, but yeah, we'll meet each other halfway there and say I can certainly hear what you're saying. I think it's right. I get worried when people think so many people are walking around thinking they have, again, as it is laid out in a DSM. I'm fine with the neurodivergence and some of the sensory issues. Like I think that. Yes, everyone's got their different things, but the actual disorders, I just think that does worry me a bit because I don't want people thinking they're walking around with different types of psychopathology. So this is a good piece here to just briefly so we can we'll go to other topics, but I mean this is straight from the DSM, right? And so this is kind of important. So when people talk about autism, I think it's important to know what, at least again in the current diagnostic standing, all the other things in the literature and the research aside, which people still continue to discuss and debate, which is great. So really when I think of autism, I just think of autism in these there's two big things that are required to have autism. And the first is persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction across multiple contexts, which is, as an example, social emotional reciprocity. So the idea that, if you smile, I know that you're happy and I smile back, or, if you frown, I can say, oh, what's wrong? There's some kind of social emotional reciprocity. Nonverbal communication, developing, maintaining, and understanding relationships. So a lot of the time, so that's the main feature. I mean, and the way it's written diagnostically is persistent deficits, not something that happens once in a blue moon, or persistent deficits in social communication and interaction across multiple contexts, not one, not two, multiple ones. And then the second is restrictive, repetitive patterns of behavior, interest, or activities. And some of the examples are these stereotyped or repetitive motor movements, insistence on sameness, inflexible adherence to routines, ritualized patterns of verbal, nonverbal behavior, highly restricted, fixated interests that are abnormal in intensity or focus, and hyper or hypo reactivity to sensory input. Again, this isn't, I need to organize my books alphabetically. I need to make sure my files on my computer have a folder. That's fine. Like, the wording here is important because I think the idea is that not everyone is pathologizing everything they're doing. So we're restrictive, repetitive behaviors, inflexible adherence, ritualized patterns, fixated interest, abnormal in intensity or it's trying to get at the severity. So these are the two big categories. So the social communication, social interaction, and then this restricted repetitive patterns of interest or activities. Three other pieces here that are also essential. Must be present in the early developmental period. So some people say as early as the first year of life, but usually around 2 or 3 years is where you see signs of autism. So this this cannot arise the first time you see it, let's say, when you're 10 years old. If you had no issues, 10, 12, nothing whatsoever, and all of a sudden you start having, insistent on sameness or, routines, that might be something different. But the hallmark feature, now, just as a footnote here, you had said, rightly so, many people do, and it gets masked or it gets, pushed down or away, or it's called something else. So, for clinicians, it's important to kind of really ask good questions to kind of see that it's in the early developmental period. But that's a critical thing. You don't get this at 38 years old one day and just like, oh, I have autism now. Like, it has to have been present in the developmental period. But I'm well aware, and most clinicians are, that it will sometimes be diagnosed as something else. It's not looked at, et cetera. So that's a critical piece. And then here's, I think, this is the language for most disorders, but I think this is what's important. causes significant impairment in social, occupational, other important areas of functioning. Significant impairment. This isn't mild or sometimes or in one setting when you're at work only. I mean, it's trying to give the severity here. And then, there's the last one, which is, it's not explained by global developmental delay or just ID only. So, when you hear that, and again, people can say, well, there's all this, drama and controversy, and this is what, a task force put together. What do they know? What's the research? What's the neuroscientists say? What's really, all this stuff, I'm fine with that. That's what you have the debates for. But as it stands, and some of this isn't too wildly different from the previous ones. I mean, they're the two big categories have always kind of been there. That's how it stands. I think that's important for people to know and to hear. And then so you have level 1, 2, and 3. It requires some support, requires substantial support, and requires very substantial support, I think, is level 3, which is some pretty severe behaviors. I mean, when you hear those, you probably know all this, of course, but I'm doing it for listeners. But what do you think about kind of the standard criteria of autism in the DSM-5? Do you have some picky things that you don't like about it, or you mostly agree with it? What are your thoughts on it?
Well, I think the key aspect of any of these kind of diagnoses is how subjective it is. I think the thing is that it appears not to be, because you've got this nice big book with pages and pages of descriptions of symptoms. So you think clearly they know they know what they're talking about. Of course, they know what they're talking about. But if you look at some of the descriptions, so for example, as you know, assessments of autism are very much to do with interviewing the parents or the carers or the teachers early on, and giving lists of lists of odd patterns of behavior, and is this unusual, or do they have difficulty making friends? And these are very, what do you mean by unusual? And do you know anything about the family's life? What have they got other children? I mean, obviously you do ask those questions, but it's less subjective than it seems. But it seems objective. So it seems very, there is a checklist, so they just work down this checklist. So I think that's one of the criticisms I have. The other aspect is this idea that you don't get autism at 10, for example. And this is where we are eventually getting into talking about the differences between females with autism and males with autism, by saying that very often, and certainly with the work that I've uncovered in writing the book and my own work, is that girls are missed, and I'm using binary girls and boys. That's another discussion, possibly.
Right.
Very early on, girls, perhaps because they've been socialized or whatever, do not appear to be as behaviorally disturbed as boys can be. So during their primary school years, I think first school, you'd call it in the States, they may not flag up any concerns. And there has been research showing that teachers, given identical stories, hypothetical stories about children with behavioral problems, will think one of the children who are called Jack are much more likely to be autistic and need help than if the child is called Chloe, for example. So there is this kind of early stage which the girl doesn't present with any problems, and then there's usually the stage where they go to secondary school or high school or whatever, and social life becomes much more complicated. It's not protected, you're not in your little small group, always in the same classroom with the same group of people. All of a sudden, it becomes more complicated. And all of these camouflaging and masking scaffolding that they've put in place is no longer fit for purpose. And this is the point, and this is a really quite dramatic difference between boys and girls. There is a point at which, with adolescence, for example, that the behavioral problems suddenly start to emerge. Now, it's not as though they were perfectly fine until then, and then something happened. It's clear that they had sufficient resources to develop strategies to get by, And then those resources are no longer sufficient. And that's the point at which all sorts of behavioral problems emerge, which again get us into the self-fulfilling prophecy. So you get high levels of eating disorders, social anxiety, school refusal, in girls who parents will say, oh, she was always fine until X. And then when more probing questions are asked about the girls' early years, you realize that actually there was something a bit unusual going on, but not enough to trigger any alarms. So I think, and that's a product of the fact that we haven't got a biomarker, if you like, which is obviously the kind of thing I'm working on. There's no test that you can say, this child is autistic. I mean, ideally, you might say, is there something we could spot before the child is born? And in a way, so much of psychiatric research is based on the idea that somewhere in this category of people with this particular label, we will eventually be able to find the brain problem or the immune system problem or the neuroendocrine problem, etc. And it will become a physical disorder, at which point, of course, it will then disappear from DSM-5 in a kind of weirdly ironic way.
Yeah.
So yes, I'm not sure.
So
yeah. Anyway, that was a rant.
You're high. No. That's you're getting exactly where I want to go. So I have so many thoughts on this. Let me just make one statement about the assessments. So you will get no challenge or pushback from me. I mean, I will not get into it because I'll go off on my own rant about the measures that we use in psychological assessment. I have many issues with them. It's a big frustrating thing for my field. Yes, some of the things you mentioned, the ADOS, ADI test, self-report measures, parent form, teacher form, client form, have some utility. It's fine. It's a nice, subjective, qualitative piece. And I know that they try to have some validity, but I mean, it really is just flimsy. And you would never just give one form and diagnose somebody from it. You need a whole battery of tests, but even still, it's very difficult. Personally, if testing for autism, I think having some test of there's a few, not a lot, but there's a few of theory of mind, because that's usually a big piece. I think having some nonverbal test. But it is, yes, the I am not a big fan of self-report measures personally. I think they're fine as adjunctives and to kind of just bring more color to the whole presentation. But using that as a kind of first order, I'm not a fan. They have a lot of weaknesses, so no disagreement for me there. So I definitely agree with you, and that's a big problem in the field. So yes, so you were coming on to what it looks like in females in the presentation, which is where you talked about a lot of it in the book, and I as you were saying this, so we can talk more about this here, but. Kind of going back to the beginning, right? In the beginning, I had said that, the history of this stuff is always with autism seems to be floating around it, these themes of inwardness, aloofness, challenges with social interactions as a major feature. And even in the current DSM-5, that's kind of essentially the first category. I guess here you can talk about it more with females, is I hear everything you're saying, but how do we, this is what makes it so hard, I guess, diagnostically or whatever, which is important for treatment. Okay, so a lot of that stuff, aloofness, inwardness, asociality or reduced asociality, sometimes people have just this kind of personality trait of high introversion. Right? Or sometimes people are, they're just more to themselves. And I don't think you're saying that. I wouldn't do that, want to pathologize that. Of course, then you have to look at other things like Some of the prodromal symptoms of schizophrenia has a lot of the negative symptoms, which you see first before positive symptoms, namely negative symptoms of anhedonia, asociality, avolition, etc., logia. The asociality piece, a lot of the times before that first psychotic break, you're going to see a lot of inwardness, being by themselves, secluded kinds of activities, things like that. And then that's not to say any other things, like, sometimes when people have a social anxiety, or, sometimes if you want to go on the further in the spectrum of things of, certain personality disorders, have avoidance personality disorder, So how do we disentangle that? I'm totally in agreement with you that I think the presentation is going to look different in females, and it might be more delayed, because the thing that frustrates me a lot is you can have symptoms and they can be in any disorder, right? Okay, you can have inattentiveness in anxiety, depression, ADHD, autism, hypomanic, and bipolar 2, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, fine. So it's instructive to look at not just the symptoms. And we cannot have this overemphasis on behavior alone, externalized behaviors. So it is a real mountain here of trying to do this to get it right, because this is important. I mean, there's a difference, with what autism looks like versus something else. So to just tell us more, I'll give you a little more runway here. How does autism look different in females? You mentioned the internalized symptoms are more prevalent. You mentioned gender socialization. You can go on and on if you want. I would love for you to talk about the camouflaging piece. I thought that was the best part in the book, how it's measured, how does it present with females. Give us more of the kind of, wide frame picture of this stuff.
Okay. Well, I think the issue is that you touched on the fact that there looks as though, the picture of autism, and if you look at the names for autism across the world, Chinese, it means the lonely disease, and Japanese, intentionally shut. There is an idea that there are individuals who are happier with their own company, don't feel the need to be very social, actually find being social quite stressful, etc. So there is a kind of picture of autism as intentionally, the term aloof, can I use the term aloof, is a kind of this individual doesn't have what looks like a characteristic, a human characteristic, a universal human characteristic of needing to be with other people, needing to be social. And that's always the picture of autism, and that was the focus of neuroscience research, for example, looking at the social brain. It was the camouflaging aspect, which, and I'm absolutely with you with respect to self-report measures, and I'm also slightly allergic to what's so-called qualitative research, which actually, it is an unfair characterization by doing the scary quotes.
Sure.
But effectively saying to somebody, what is it like to be you? And I think with respect to autism in females, and that's not all females, sometimes males, but mainly females, that has been a very revealing question, because by nature, if somebody's hiding the fact that they're autistic, or they're camouflaging their difficulties, then you won't be able to spot them. So it's not until you actually ask them to say, by the way, is this how you live your life? And the camouflaging then revealed this difficulty that this group of what I call the chameleons have. And then, of course, you start to think, we had a lot of time of measuring how you might detect this, and what it actually made people behave like. But the key question is why? If being autistic means that you don't care you don't want to be social, you don't want to belong to other groups, why should you care so much about people spotting that you're autistic, that you go through an exhausting development of strategies of diverting attention from yourself or trying to fit in? Why would you do that if you didn't actually want to be social. And for me, that's the key difference in this group of people. They clearly want to be social. Both groups appear not to have the, if you like, brain science, the necessary neural networks, if you like. But one lot actually want, they have the motivation to be social, the drive to be social, perhaps, whereas the other group don't. And I think that characterizes the difference quite strongly between what I call the canna autistic individuals and the chameleon autistic individuals. The whole book, I mean, the book is called, Off the Spectrum, which kind of slightly avoids the binary, it's all males or all females, which is another conversation. Okay, so I think that's where females are different. There is another aspect which interestingly came in later and only with DSM-5, where there's evidence that females have much more difficulty with sensory problems, hyper-responsiveness to light, sound, smells, touch, tastes in particular. That's now become a diagnostic criterion, which it wasn't before, interestingly. So that may be partly behind the increase in diagnoses in females, which is starting to come through. So I think autism does present differently in one group of people as opposed to the others, and most of the first group of females. So I think that's something which we're only becoming aware of, which of course you could say in defense of the diagnostic community, if this group were so good at hiding the fact that they had autism, that's why they weren't spotted. If you want to let the diagnostic community off the hook.
Well, let's not let them off the hook just yet. They still got a lot of problems to fix, problems they created. But okay, so I'm fully with you, and I think yes, I've read a little bit on how the sensory processing bit looks or presents a bit different with females, or is more prevalent with females. That's not to say that it isn't with males, but what do we know both neuroanatomically and genetically about what is different between males and females? So in the book, you talk about the anterior cingulate cortex, which is usually associated with the socialization of aspects of people, theory of mind capabilities, and of course, there's predictive processing, which is true for both folks. But there's the symptoms, there's how they present, and there's maybe some behaviors. But what's, as far as we know, going on genetically, neuroanatomically, you can talk about, is there any sexual dimorphism? I know this is kind of getting to your other book that you talked about. So, but yeah, what is this? Tell us about what's going on in the head, as opposed to just not what's presenting.
Right. Well, I'm glad you asked that question, because in a way that was part of the motivation for the book, because the whole idea of the autism is a boy thing turned out to be playing out very powerfully in my own sphere of work, which was looking at autistic brains. And so the early studies were, for all sorts of reasons, up till about 10 years ago, maybe a bit less, they were almost all done on males. So you were actually took as for granted that autism is a male thing. So neuroscientists, practically, financially, etc., very difficult to do this kind of research. Went to get your participants. The world was full of diagnosed autistic males. And again, you'll remember from the other part of the book, even if you did a kind of community, let's have a look at individuals in the community with high autistic traits, your funding body might say, well, you can only look at people who are genuinely, really autistic. And so you gave them ADOS and ADI or whatever test you were using. And the females that you'd identified as potential participants were excluded from the studies. So the consequence was, for all sorts of reasons, the early work was only done on males. So we had a neuroanatomical model, which was never identified as, by the way, I'm only doing research on males. I mean, it was kind of given. So we had a picture that you talked about, the anterior cingulate, which is part of the social brain network. So we have a kind of social knowledge processing aspect in the frontal areas. I mean, not to make too rigid a mechanistic model, we have the kind of emotional coding system where that was a great social experience. Do that again and you'll belong to your in-group, or that was really devastating. Whatever you do, don't do that kind of thing again. And the anterior cingulate, which is the kind of regulatory traffic light system. So all of that was investigated. And it looked like when you put an individual in the scanner and gave them some kind of social experience, a social rejection task, which could just be playing a video game and constantly being overlooked by the other players kind of thing. It looked as though the social brain was less responsive to social activities, particularly negative social experiences. So this, of course, fitted in neatly with the model of, this is why individuals are aloof. They don't seem to be interested in social interaction. They're very poor at it when they do it because they don't have much experience of it, etc. And then once people started saying, you do realize there are females on the spectrum and they appear to present slightly differently. So from about 2015 onwards, so 10 years, started doing the same sort of tasks, but with females as well. And they found quite a different pattern of behavior. It almost looked as though the social aspects of the brain, particularly the responsiveness to negative social experiences, were hyperactive. So we've got two different patterns of behavior, which again fit into the idea that one group of those people are less motivated by social activities, and another people are highly motivated and hugely distressed by negative social experiences. So you ask about the neuroscience, and there are genetic factors associated with that, because there was this idea from early on that because there were fewer females, this was accepted as a given. Maybe females had some kind of protective effect, which is very unusual because female biology is not usually hailed for its protective effect. So geneticists were saying there is some kind of buffering available given to females by their biology, which means they are less likely to present as autistic. And I'm using that term because those girls who did present as autistic, i.e. who did jump over the various hurdles, male-biased hurdles, and got a diagnosis, if you looked at the genomes of those individuals, they seem to be much more impaired. So it's almost as though females needed a bigger hit before they actually passed the threshold. So there's obviously something else protecting, whatever it was that got you diagnosed as autistic. And we're now looking at, well, not me particularly, but looking at the genes which determine responsiveness to certain types of neurotransmitters and to certain types of hormones, etc., to see if there are male-female differences in that. Or again, doesn't have to be male-female. There could be differences, but it's not necessarily tied to whether you're XX or XY.
Yeah. It's very, very interesting. I think that hearing this stuff always just makes me excited for all the new research that's coming out. So I guess a bit of a kind of a quick fire thing here, just because you touch on the book, and I just want to kind of get your thoughts on some of these things. There's a comorbidity of females with autism and eating disorders. Yes, tell us about what's this overlap look like.
Yeah, that's really interesting because, in fact, early on, there was a suggestion that maybe females with eating disorders were the equivalent of males with autism or autistic males, because they showed similar sort of obsessiveness and rigidity and lack of flexibility, etc. And so that was a kind of debate which went on for a bit. And there is a higher incidence of eating disorders in autistic females than in non-autistic females. So is there something going on? Is there something, as you say, a comorbidity is whatever it is that determines autism, also determining eating disorders? Are they actually separate disorders? But actually now people are looking at this more carefully, and the eating disorders in females are actually, or the presentation of eating disorder is not the same as the presentation of eating disorders in anorexic individuals who are not autistic. So the issue of anorexia, and it's not an area of expertise, but the issue of anorexia in girls is very often to do with body image and weight, concern about weight and self-presentation. Whereas in autistic girls, their eating disorder is much more to do with aversion to tastes and colours and strange patterns of behaviour, like not liking runny food on the same to touch itself on a plate. So, you get the sausage bridge between the baked beans and the whatever. Sorry. So it presents differently. I mean, and it's interestingly, when you talk to autistic girls who also have eating disorders, they very often have been diagnosed, first of all, with an eating disorder. And this is the characteristic of the secondary school girls who suddenly present with this devastating condition, get sent off to an anorexia clinic, and they get sent back because the anorexia clinic will say, it's not anorexia, it's autism. So at that level, it is clear that those clinicians can distinguish. So it's to do with a presentation that, and very often it's also an identity thing. I mean, talking to specialists in autistic, in dealing with autistic girls, they'll say, they will become the best eating disordered patient there is, best in terms of the most extreme, because they will be searching for an identity. They want to belong to this group of people. What's cool in this group of people? Being cool in this group of people is being so severely ill that you're intubated, etc. So how they arrive at that presentation of disorder, and I use that term advisedly, is via their autism. And I think this comes back to your point about, what are we, this is autism in some individuals, this is eating disorders in others, which tells you a bit about the uncertainty around those terms.
Yeah. It's once you start looking at, comorbidities, it does start to become a bit of a mess. Reading this in the book, it's towards the end. I think the literature on this is still pretty new from what I understand, but I have read a little bit of this, is that there is a high overlap with females with autism and gender dysphoria. And I was curious about this. I mean, it does seem to be a pretty high overlap, but what's the kind of the hypotheses we can make about this overlap, at least in the current research stage, that it might change or not, but what do you think about this?
Right. Yeah, it's very interesting. And I think possibly has really important implications for understanding identity. Some of the discussions with autistic females who are, I don't like the term gender incongruent because it suggests that it's, who are gender variant, if you like. They will say, well, all of my life I've grown up, I've not been able to understand who I am. They don't have very good self-image. So you get the girls the masqueraders, the maskers, who are always somebody else, depending on where they are, to try and fit in, or the camouflagers who try not to be anything so that nobody notices them. So they say, I arrive at the point in my life, which is very often adolescence, where I'm supposed to be developing a self-identity, and I have no idea who I am. And there's a big emphasis during adolescence, well, actually lifelong, but, are you male or are you female? And this is what being a female is like. And they'll think to themselves, well, none of the above. And so it's a bit like the eating disordered aspect. It's the presentation which says this person expresses gender variance. They don't feel their identity is the same as their biological sex. But this could be because their autism has rendered their security in a sense of self-identity. They have such insecurity that they don't have any identity. And some autistic females say, actually, my autistic identity is more important. So if somebody says, are you male or female, or are you masculine or feminine? It's not something they've even thought about. So they'll shrug their shoulders, or none of the above, or prefer not to say, or whatever, which gets them put into the category of gender invariant, a phrase. So I think it's very interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting. Again, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say there is some issue that some autistic females say they sometimes feel they have to mask their autism when they're seeking support for their gender invariance, because there's a feeling that, oh, well, if you're autistic, then you don't know yourself, or how could you possibly declare yourself as gender invariant? So there is a kind of anxiety that undermines something they wish to explore.
Yeah, I really feel for these folks, because there's a lot of things going on, and they're just trying to sort it out on a variety of different categories, and that's a lot. That's a lot to go through. I mean, I think if you put yourself in any one of those folks' positions, that's a lot. It's a lot to sift through. It's a lot to sort out. It's a lot to deal with stuff from people around them, and people in the environment, and society, and then themselves, and it's a lot. There's a lot going on. So it's just more things to research and hopefully get some good answers on. Well, I guess the final question I have for you is, what is where do we go? I guess more specifically with how we look at autism in females. What are the right questions to ask so they don't get missed or underdiagnosed, and how can we try to have more good answers so they can get the right individualized treatment that they need?
Well, I think and it might challenge us anyway, if you accepted the idea that there is a constellation of problems called autism, then I think we need to be asking better questions. And I think the awareness of this kind of camouflaging and masking behavior has started that. So I think that's good, because it means that you can actually identify people who feel it necessary to disguise the fact that they're struggling. And if, as a good clinician, you actually want to help them, then it's good to find out that there are ways to identify that. It's a bit like if you're a doctor of physical medicine and somebody was saying, no, my lungs don't hurt when I cough, etc. Somebody, why would they be doing that? So the fact that they are doing that is something that people should be aware of. I think also the idea that certainly with autism, there's been a big emphasis on training the autistic person to be social, and running them through all sorts of classes to understand facial expressions. And so be aware that there is a group of individuals who know fully well what the signs and cues they should be paying attention to, because that's what they've been doing all their life. So, making sure that the support you're giving them is appropriate, and it's not a one size fits all. And quite possibly autism it is not one size fits all is more true of all sorts of atypical patterns of behavior than any other. A more radical suggestion would be, let's get rid of the whole idea of autism. Let's focus on what it is that makes life difficult for people, and find ways of supporting them, which would be less popular, I think. Dismantling the whole of the kind of psychiatric and diagnostic industry would not go down well.
Well, I do agree that I think we need to figure out, how we can meet people where they're at to try and help them navigate the world and navigate social situations. That is more, there's an element of adjusting to social context, but also that it doesn't need to be not considerate sometimes of the individual, of just where their difference is. And so I think that that's super instructive. Gina, this is such a really exhilarating conversation. I really enjoyed it. Getting in the weeds on some of this stuff. It was a lot of fun to do. And your book is really great in highlighting an issue.
Yeah, you sent me 17 questions or something beforehand, so which is a record.
Yeah, well, we want to try and get as much of the details for myself and for listeners and all that. So I'm really thankful you came on and were able to kind of navigate through some of these tough issues. Your work is great, and so big thanks for coming on.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.